The day one patch does a lot. That said, the expectation for using a below min-spec machine should be that the game is unplayable. That the game runs at all on your system is a miracle. That you can get 55 to 60 FPS out of heavy combat is actually incredible given how the engine and what's going on under the hood. Your specification doesn't indicate if you're on SDD or HDD, but that could also explain some of the hitching. It's a big, bold, new seamless world, and I'm sorry to say that older hardware may not provide buttery smooth performance for the latest gen AAA games, as has always been the case since the dawn of PC gaming. That is Randy Pitchford, who is the lead developer of Borderlands 4, and I've seen a lot of articles, like I originally found this here, kind of reporting this a little bit out of context, so I do think it's important to analyze this in the context of the actual post it's replying to, which was a Destructoid article saying that Borderlands 4 Final Impressions, while it's shaping up to be a potential new classic, a day one patch is set to fix some PC performance hiccups, update, and there is a lot to talk about here in these updates. Now, in general, I was originally just setting out to make a PC system requirements video regarding Borderlands 4, and what led me down this rabbit hole was this is one of the really old-fashioned system requirements lists where there's just minimum and recommended, but there's no indication of what minimum means or what recommended means. Is recommended 1080p 60 FPS at medium settings, or is it 1440p 60 FPS at maximum settings? Is there upscaling involved? Are minimum settings 720p 30 FPS at low settings, or are they 1080p 60 FPS at low settings, or 1080p 30 FPS at low settings? You see what I'm saying, right? So a lot of newer games have much better system requirements lists than this, where there's at least a resolution and frame rate target alongside the specs. So I went down the rabbit hole of trying to find out, had the Borderlands 4 developers given any sort of indication somewhere else besides this page on what performance to expect from the minimum system requirements. And this quote is the best information I can find on that. So the answer is, if you have below in RTX 2070 or AMD Radeon RX 5700 XT or an Intel Arc A580, that you should expect the game running at all to be a miracle. That is the official word from the lead developer on the game. Now, in the end, I mean, I do understand that is what min specs means, right? So like min spec does mean these are the minimum you need to run the game, and anything below this, it's a miracle if it runs. But in reality, a lot of games do run below their minimum spec just fine. And honestly, I have a hope, at least, that that's also the case here. Because quite frankly, a lot of people do have a worse graphics card than an RTX 2070. If we pop over to Tech Power-Up's relative performance chart for the RTX 2070, which is an 8GB graphics card released back on October of 2018 at a $500 price point. So yeah, that is 7 years ago now, but $500 graphics card 7 years ago, and honestly, at the lower end, performance hasn't increased a lot since then. RTX 2070 is also right alongside the performance of an RTX 3060. The 3060 did have more VRAM, but performance overall was very similar. Again, depending on whose benchmarks you look at and at what game, things can vary a little bit from this chart, but within 10% or so performance is pretty typical result to see there. Even a 1080 Ti is kind of in this same general ballpark, and the 2070 Super wasn't a lot more powerful than this. Even much newer cards like an RX 7600, they're within 20% of the performance of a 2070. So, I mean, cards like the RTX 5050, brand new, they're barely ahead of these minimum specs. The RTX 4060, okay, 26% ahead. But in general, what I'm trying to say here is that the lower end specs, like on 60 and 50 class cards, for a while now, haven't surpassed like 2070 performance by all that much. So I just want to mention that. Now, really, I think what we're going to need to get is actual benchmarks of this game to figure out what is going on here. Because again, 2070 is fairly steep if that's what it takes to run the game at all, barring some sort of miracle. Anyway, now additionally, we have the processor being listed as a Core i7-9700 or Ryzen 7 2700X. Again, those are from a while back. I would say that, a Ryzen 7 2700X isn't worlds apart from like PS5 CPU level performance. I'm hoping this game's able to run at 60 FPS on a PS5. So hopefully, these are maybe somewhat overstated, meaning I'm hoping that these minimum requirements are actually for 60 FPS, probably using upscaling and at low settings, and that maybe you can at least play the game at 30 FPS on lower hardware. But we will have to see, and again, maybe you'll need some kind of a miracle for that to happen. I'm not sure this is a great quote to put out there as the lead developer of a game. Just gonna say that. Anyway, again, they also are saying that this requires 8 CPU cores for the processor. Now, again, this doesn't really make a lot of sense because as a lot of recent testing, like actually Hardware Unboxed tested this out pretty recently, a newer 6-core processor will generally outperform an older 8-core processor because you can just fit in, all those processing tasks, they can get split up to fewer cores if the cores can just cycle quicker. Anyway, so again, that shouldn't be a big deal. Now, the SSD being required to play without hitching and assets loading in, I definitely take note of that. And again, that does line up with this, where he's saying, if you're on a hard drive, that could explain some hitching. Anyway, so yeah, like, I don't think they're asking for a crazy system here if this is actually like 60-ish FPS or 50 to 60 FPS at low settings, maybe with quality level upscaling on a 1080p display, and that you could still play the game on lower hardware. But like I said, if it's going to require a miracle to even boot the game on anything less than this, that's going to be a bit rough. And the recommended specs are considerably higher, like significantly higher. Recommended is stepping all the way up to an RTX 3080 or an AMD RX 6800 XT. Now, interestingly, also an Intel Arc B580. Now, also they're jumping up from 16 gigabytes of system RAM to 32 gigabytes of system RAM. They don't list VRAM, but a 3080 did have 10 gigabytes. 6800 was 16 and B580 is 12. So there's some indication here that you might at least need more than 8 and maybe 10. Also, CPUs jumping up all the way up to an i7 12700 or Ryzen 7 5800X. So also asking for a lot more on the CPU side of things here. So everything's stepping up quite a bit. Let's look at Tech PowerUp's relative performance chart then. So again, according to the game's lead developer, to even boot the game, barring some sort of miracle and play it, you need an RTX 2070 class GPU. Now, if we go up from here, you might spot your GPU somewhere in here, and these would be GPUs that are doing better than just barely running the game, but to get up to the recommended spec, we do have to go quite a bit. Notice that we're going all the way up here to get to that RTX 3080, basically double the performance. Now, that could mean a lot of things. That could mean that these minimum specs are 30 FPS, 1080p, medium or low settings, and then the recommended is 60 FPS, which would require double the performance, to go up from 30 to 60 at those same settings, whatever they are. Maybe, like I said, maybe if this was 1080p low 30, maybe this is 1080p low 60 at native resolution, maybe. Again, they don't give us a lot of information to work off of here, but I do think that an RTX 3080 class performance is a big ask because, again, if we look at what sorts of GPUs that's around, if we set the 3080 as the baseline, notice that, because generational hardware improvements have slowed down so much recently, just keep in mind that that's like 5060 Ti. So like a brand new $430 GPU class, is actually less performant than an RTX 3080, at least on this performance chart. Okay, so do keep that in mind. That this is still a fairly steep ask. We're talking RTX 4070 class performance, and even new $550 graphics cards like an RTX 5070 is barely more powerful than an RTX 3080, okay? So, again, I'm not sure what kind of performance this is getting us. I think, are you guys interested in me actually benchmarking this game when it comes out? I do have a 3080 I could test. I have a 6800 XT I could test. I have a B580. I don't have a 2070 anymore, actually, or a 5700 XT, but I do have like a 3060, which is on a similar performance class that we could take a look at. Now, again, though, one thing that does seem a little bit odd here to me is the Intel Arc B580 being listed with the 3080 and 6800 XT here. Because if I keep the 3080 as the baseline, the Arc B580 is only 62% of that performance. So that's weird. That's a huge performance difference to be thrown into this tier. But again, if you're just saying recommended, it's meaningless anyway, because they're not giving any kind of particular resolution or frame rate targets. Anyway, what does this game even look like? So I was trying to find some PC footage. So this is the game, running apparently at maximum settings at 4K, 60 FPS on an RTX 5090. So this is kind of the sort of visuals we're getting. And, it seems to still have that classic, Borderlands, cel-shaded comic booky sort of look. And I know it's been pushed up since previous games, and the game's going to be a lot bigger open worlds and everything. But man, if they're really asking a lot, I think that they're going to get a bit of a pushback, because this style of graphics isn't the style of graphics that I think a lot of people are going to accept as being extremely demanding to run. It just doesn't seem to justify that. Now, the environments, and he is talking about a seamless open world. So there is that, right? That does have its demand, and they are now using Unreal Engine 5, which has a pretty big performance cost. So is this game going to be the latest kind of unoptimized Unreal Engine 5 stuttery, low-performance disaster, or is it actually going to run pretty well? Again, there is apparently a day one performance patch coming in that does a lot, so I think we should wait for that before making any kind of final conclusions. And again, I do think it's important, because you may have seen this comment reported on elsewhere, as I mentioned earlier in the video, that some articles are taking this a bit out of context. So he was specifically replying to this Destructoid article, and the Destructoid article was mentioning the game crashing and hitching severely. Now, there has been some updates to it since then, where the author of the article actually mentions that his PC was actually having some power supply issues, and once they were repaired, some of the worst cases of the performance issues were resolved. Now, that being said, his PC specs were actually well above the minimum. It was an RTX 3070 and an Intel i7-12700K with only 16 gigabytes of RAM. And again, he was running on the low preset at 1080p. Again, that is a little bit below the recommended, because the GPU is below recommended, but well above, I think about 50% more powerful than the minimum GPU, and was matching the recommended CPU, but didn't have the recommended system RAM. So it was certainly a between minimum and recommended spec build. But again, he did say that after getting the power supply repaired in his PC, it was running better than it was when he was initially complaining about that. So that's what this was in reply to, was to that article. Now, anyway, there is this point here at the end, though, that maybe I'll leave us with as let me know what you think in the comment section, because He said the claim is it's a big, bold, new, seamless world, and I'm sorry to say that older hardware may not provide buttery smooth performance for the latest gen AAA games, as has always been the case since the dawn of PC gaming. And I will say that when we see a lot of pushback about new games requiring better hardware to run well, I mean, that really has been the case with PC gaming for a long time. I think where there's this disconnect between that, I mean, actually being true, that has been the case, and how people are feeling now is the fact that I think the graphical improvements that we're seeing are just less obvious than what we used to see in the past. So while games are pushing forward, they already started looking pretty good a while ago. So especially in a game with this style of art, even if it does actually look better and is a lot harder to run than previous entries, it might be harder to appreciate that than previous generational leaps we saw when we were going from like super pixelated stuff to somewhat realistic looking stuff. And also, again, as I had been mentioning, that the hardware advancements have slowed down significantly. Again, the fact that an 80 class GPU from the 3080 generation, meaning from back in 2020, so this is 5 years ago, the fact that a brand new 2 generations further, 5 years newer RTX 5070 class GPU is barely faster than that, is unheard of. Previous generations, the new 70 class would usually be on par with or beating the previous flagship class GPU, let alone 2 generations further on with the 70 class. So there's this kind of disconnect where we're getting these slowdowns in hardware advancement combined with graphics getting better, but it being harder to spot those differences. To where when the developers feel like, well, it's always been the case that you need better hardware to run the game. That's true, but it's getting harder to appreciate those advancements that we're seeing, and it's getting harder to actually upgrade your system at a reasonable price if you just keep waiting for better hardware to be out there and affordable, and the prices aren't going down and the performance is barely going up. Let me know what you guys think about all of this in the comments section and whether or not you're interested in me actually trying to test this out when the game launches. Because again, unfortunately, not a lot of info here other than the minimum looks pretty high if that's literally what you need to run the game at all, barring some kind of miracle. Hope all of you have an excellent day.